Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for California Lawyers for the Arts, Intersections, Art, and Law at the Border, our second annual symposium. Tonight is the third of 6 virtual webinars that will run through July 30th. My name is Diana Cervera, and I am the Program Manager for California Lawyers for the Arts San Diego. I'm joined tonight by our Special Projects Coordinator, Sara Gonzalez, who co-led this project and helped make this event possible. Also on the call are members of our statewide staff, including our Executive Director, Alma Robinson, and Gloria Ruiz Oster, our newly appointed Southern California Director. Before we begin tonight's program, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the land that we are on is native land. The border region of San Diego-Tijuana is the ancestral territory and homeland of the Kumeyaay Nation, past, present, and future. We recognize that we are guests in the Kumeyaay's homeland, and as guests, I extend my respects and gratitude to the many indigenous peoples who still reside here and call these lands their homes. Now I'd like to turn it over to Sara Gonzalez, who will share with you a little bit about California Lawyers for the Arts and the services we offer across the state.
Thank you, Diana, for that warm welcome. Today, I'll be talking about California Lawyers for the Arts. California Lawyers for the Arts is a statewide nonprofit that was founded in 1974. Serving artists and arts organizations. We currently have offices in San Francisco, Berkeley, Sacramento, Los Angeles, and the brand new branch in San Diego. We offer 3 core services for the arts community. The first is our Lawyer Referral and Information Service, which is a State Bar of California certified. The LRIS matches creative artists with attorneys throughout all of California. We also administer the California Inventors Assistance Program to assist independent inventors and small startups with their patent legal issues. Our Arts, Arbitration, and Mediation Services, also known as the AAMS, provides low-cost community conflict resolution services which seek to resolve disputes for involved parties outside of court. Finally, we have what brings you here this evening, our education programming, where we offer a variety of workshops, symposia, and conferences on various legal topics for artists and arts organizations. Please visit our website, calawyersforthearts.org, for more information.
Hello, my name is Jonathan Gless. I'm the Executive Director of the Commission for Arts and Culture for the City of San Diego. I'd like to welcome you to this second annual Art and Law at the Border Symposium. On behalf of the Commission, I'd like to thank California Lawyers for the Arts for their partnership, their leadership, and for producing this important event. I'll be attending along with you and look forward to virtually meeting you in the coming days. Welcome to the conversation.
The US-Mexico border has been described as an open wound, an arbitrary divide delineating the meeting of nation states and defining that which is inside and that which is left out. Characterized by constant tempering and transmutation, a border region is a delicate and complex ecosystem fraught with the push and pull of political attitudes, global debates on migration, and intricate networks of power. Artistic and legal adaptations manifest in this liminal space. Artists challenge us to investigate what exists between and beyond the walls, to reimagine our world as a place where many realities coexist. Legal advocates strive to impact the evolution of relationships at borders and improve the movement of people and ideas. California Lawyers for the Arts invites artists, activists, scholars, and researchers to explore, complicate, and expand our understanding of the concept of border. Without further ado, we'd like to introduce you to tonight's panelist.
This panel explores the efforts of activist organizations who execute humanitarian work in response to migrants arriving at the border and changes in border policy. Today, we will showcase the work of 2 grassroots organizations working along the US-Mexico border. To begin, we present Border Angels. Since January of 2016, Border Angels has traveled into the desert with groups of volunteers to leave water, food, and other critical supplies in an attempt to mitigate health risks and death while migrants are crossing through the desert along the US-Mexico border. Providing humanitarian aid via water drops has changed since the trial of Dr. Scott Warren in 2018 and the current political climate. Border Angels Waterdrop Co-Directors Jacqueline Arellano and James Cordero will speak about these changes and how they continue to carry on these efforts.
Hello, everyone.
Hey there.
So yes, as Sara said, we're with Border Angels. My name's Jacqueline, and this is James. We are co-directors for the Waterdrop program. What that entails is taking water to the Southern California borderlands where folks have been migrating forever. We've been doing this for the last 4 years. Border Angels had been doing it for a significantly longer period of time. But in 2016, with the shifting administration and political climate in the country, this became open to the public to attend and become involved in. And there was just huge, massive response to the point that we had to limit attendance. And with time going on, we've become a lot more strategic, and we've learned a lot more than we ever thought possible about the border and the particularities of this work. So we'll kind of get into why we do what we do. What would you say, why do we do what we do?
Because we all have some sort of privilege, and we go out there and we use the privilege. We all came from immigrants somewhere, unless you're, completely native to this land, your ancestors have come from somewhere else. And so we're just trying to pass that on down the line, since we all have, for the most part in our group, first generation or second generation citizens. So we want to pay it forward and make sure that people, can have the same type of, lives that we do have here in America.
It's a humanitarian crisis that I think is something that one has to be involved in to learn the scope of. And then even for those of us that are involved on the ground, it's like peeling the layers off of horrible onion. Like, it's incredibly complicated, and however bad we think the situation is, it's worse. That's what we've come to learn. So, little history. One of the things that made the situation in the borderlands in the desert so difficult and so deadly is the set of policies called Prevention Through Deterrence, and this was established in 1994. So in that year, they decided to implement a set of policies, technologies, increase staffing, that sort of thing, in order to make the desert and the hostile terrain in the borderlands the only area that people are able to migrate through. So meaning that they put up walls in urban areas, set up checkpoints along the highway, and this is literally a Border Patrol strategy and a term that they have called funneling. So the intention was to funnel people from survivable areas of the borderlands into hostile terrain, supposedly with the intention of deterring people with how difficult it was. They claim that this had an unintended effect of an unimaginably huge scope of just death on the border. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. But the commissioner at the time was quoted as saying that their intention was to use nature as an ally in order to curb migration. So they were well within, all the information that they had to expect the level of death which has occurred. Another thing that happened in '94, coincidentally, was that NAFTA passed. So the North American Free Trade Agreement passed. And what happened with NAFTA, and why we say coincidentally it was not such a coincidence, is that this trade agreement decimated farming in Mexico. And over 1 million jobs, farm worker, indigenous labor jobs, were lost as a result of NAFTA almost immediately. This was expected to result, and it did result, with a huge push for migration. And that same year is when they put these policies into effect. How many deaths this has caused is something that is of debate, and basically nobody really knows. Some estimates are, I think the Border Patrol estimate is...
Border Patrol estimate is very low.
Yeah.
But realistically, it's somewhere in the number plus or minus of 10,000 people. And whether that's, just a few people, or if it's even more than 10,000 people, it still shouldn't be happening. And that was an intended effect by the US government over 25 years ago to inflict this pain, to inflict this harm, to try to press, I think, people to the max, to the limits. Mm-hmm. as we learn more, as we find out more, we come up with more theories and stuff like that, but it definitely was intended for cruelty and to try to deter people that if people are dying and harming themselves in the desert, that others will not want to risk that. But when you're dying and you have no chances of life where you live, you're going to go, and that's nature, animals, humans, everybody. You go to where you have a greater chance of surviving and living.
Exactly. And, the way that they discussed prevention through deterrence as having this unintended effect of mass death, it's really interesting because despite the fact that they've said that, these policies have in no way been rolled back at all. So they've actually escalated in massive, massive ways. So it leads everybody to believe that this is it's not an accident. This is by design. So the border industrial complex, the militarization of our border has been just astronomical in the last several years. It's bolstered by a lot of corporations and their interests, corporations like Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics. They have just multi-billion-dollar contracts with CBP, and these companies are also among the biggest lobbyists in the country that have an influence on passing of laws for things like security and privacy and, the technology involved in such. So it's extremely escalated now to where the monitoring supposedly of the border security is now bleeding into every aspect of, our lives here, not just for those who are migrating. The contracts that are involved, ICE, so just between 2006 and 2018, ICE has a total of $18.2 billion in contracts. CBP has a total of $27 billion in contracts, and the Coast Guard has $35.3 billion. Their budgets are also astronomical. So if they didn't intend to cause all this death and it wasn't actually something that was, a motivating factor, their budgets wouldn't have ballooned 6,000% since the 80s. So in the 80s, the border militarization or the border security budget, which at the time was INS, was $350 million. And now between ICE and CBP, it's $23.7 billion.
So you want to think that, everything that we're seeing lately, the fence and Trump and everybody wants to put the blame maybe on one person or one party, but it's been going on since 1994. It started in 94, and for those that were around back then or just know some history of the United States, back in 94, that was a Democratic president called Bill Clinton. And since Clinton, there was Bush and Obama. And there's a lot of fence built during both of those terms as well, those administrations. So it's not a red thing, it's not a blue thing, it's a green thing. It's always been about money, and that's why fences, keep changing and getting taller and taller every so often throughout history. It's not, as they want to tell you, to make it harder for people to come across, because the United States needs immigrants. And that's something that the government has proven for a long time. And it's all about the green, it's all about the money, it's all about an exchange of taxpayer money into the hands of those that are in the pockets of the politicians that are passing these laws, passing these policies, passing these budgets, inflating everything, and they just mask it as national security. And a lot of stats after the fences have been built have been forged. It was proven back in the mid-90s after Operation Gatekeeper first started in San Diego, and Border Patrol was busted. They were accused and proven for falsifying reports about apprehensions, trying to claim that they were very low to basically hardly ever happening because this great fence worked so well. And the fence was just around the ports of entries at that time, just maybe a couple miles outside the ports of entry. And that's how the whole border fence and prevention through deterrence started. It was to block out these ports of entries because that's where most people, came through. Now you push them out to the desert, everything's hidden out there. Most of these, areas where there's zero fence or zero type of prevention from people coming through are out in the middle of nowhere. No one will ever see them except for humanitarian organizations like us, No More Deaths in Arizona, and those others that provide the aid and help out there that's needed. So when those get put up in those areas, people get pushed out, and it's just a big take of money. And it's all about money and inflicting as much harm as possible to try to maybe get out, as they call it, the survival of the fittest. And unfortunately, thousands upon thousands, and they say that it's around 10,000 bodies disappear in the desert. There's been numerous studies out in Arizona that bodies can disappear in less than a month out in the desert. So for all the bodies that human remains, these are people. For every body that is recovered, there are so many that are not, either because they disappear and into the earth, or they're not, in areas where people can do a search and reach out and get to them, because such a big land grab has been pushing a lot of the borderlands into private or federal or military possession. Therefore, a lot of humanitarian aid organizations are unable to even get out into these areas legally to look for people.
Exactly. And just kind of to touch on us being completely unable to know the scope of the loss of human life that has occurred from this, brutal sets of policies, is that, we were in Arizona doing a search and rescue, or search and recovery at that point. And despite the fact that, the big umbrella of border protection is the largest law enforcement agency in the whole country, they are not recovering remains. They are not even cooperating with the agencies that do so. So in this afternoon that we were out, we were going to double check on some human remains that had been discovered months prior. And we came across 5 sets that day. And one in particular was a human pelvis that had been left in a sandy arroyo. And this was deep in the desert, and there were quad marks. So Border Patrol quad marks, because nobody else is out there, that had led up to the pelvis and done a U-turn and left. So that's what weighs on us really heavily, is the fact that none of us know, as James said, how many people have disappeared into the desert, and this has been decades in the making, and it's only accelerating. What makes this journey so difficult is, taking it back to like our desert, and sometimes where we are, people tend to think that it's an easier journey for people because our desert is much smaller than Arizona's. Technically, you can hike from the line, you can hike from the border to one of the freeways like the A in a day. But because of these prevention through deterrence policies, there have been numerous checkpoints that have come up on the freeways. And during the Trump administration, we have seen those checkpoints that used to be manned sporadically now are manned essentially 24/7, like almost every day of the year, almost constantly. These checkpoints have people at the station. And so what we have observed through our work is that this has pushed people from a 3 to 10 to 20 mile journey into what we are finding evidence of being up to like 60, 70 plus miles. What would you say?
Yeah, when Jack was talking about, one day, this is a 1 day nonstop, 24 hours moving, perfect conditions. Most of the time we're going out there, especially right now in the summertime, we're going out maybe about 5-6 miles round trip, and we're out there for about 8 hours, and we have to get back to the car. We have to get back to AC. The conditions out there, especially in the summertime, are so extreme and so brutal, you can't find shade anywhere. You are in a sea of desert. So with those checkpoints, the way they're set up, strategically, is that in San Diego County and Imperial County, you have to go at a maximum around 50 to 65 miles to get to roads and get picked up to an area where you can avoid checkpoints altogether. And in Arizona, some points can get up to 100 miles. Now, 100 miles, that can take people, in a week,
About.
and that's in Arizona because there's a lot more flat ground and open ground. In our areas that we go to all the time, our distances are a lot shorter, but there are big mountains full of humongous rocks, boulders, arroyos, all that you're pushing through sand and you're climbing over rocks, and the time that it takes to do all that and still try to stay undetected by Border Patrol is something that should take, maybe like a day or two, that takes maybe 3-4+ days to get to that point. And that's the easiest pickup point. And if you have to go even further to avoid all checkpoints altogether, I mean, you're looking at over a week. And, unfortunately, we go through those areas and we see how brutal they are. And we've seen some, we always see like scenarios of after the fact because we don't really run across people when we're out there too often, but we see stuff that's left behind, and we can kind of piece together stories of some of people's journeys, what they're doing or what they're coming across as they're making their way through that point. And some are just are sad. They're potentially tragic. And in Arizona, people are found, over 300, human remains are found every year. And, that's almost one a day out there. So we are out there all the time. Before COVID hit, we were out there twice a month. We would take big groups out one weekend, and then on another weekend, we'd take more advanced hikers out there and go further distances. Right now with COVID, we're unable to take large groups of people out there. So what we do is we go out every single weekend now. And it's tough work. And our volunteers that come out with us weekend after weekend, we really appreciate it so much because we're out there, and right now it's like this weekend's going to be around 120 degrees, and the last few weekends have been around 110, 112 degrees. And you're out there, 5, 6, 7 hours and got all this weight that you're carrying on your back. But it's worth it. It's worth it because we see the consumption levels. We see people using our supplies that we leave out there, and that's what keeps us going.
And what James mentioned before about the challenge, like with this land grab, that's also something that's posing a difficulty because, COVID has made this more challenging in terms of logistics and number of volunteers, because obviously we want to socially distance and maintain safety precautions for our team while being aware that we cannot stop this work. But in just, probably since COVID has complicated matters, we've seen the evidence of a pretty steep increase in evidence of traveling. And the land grab that he's talking about is things like, land being classified as federal land being classified as state park. And we are limited to where we can actually leave supplies due to that. There is limited protection for organizations such as ours, as we saw with, Scott Warren's case, in leaving humanitarian aid supplies in certain types of land. We can be prosecuted for that. And that poses a challenge here. It poses an incredible challenge all along the border.
I'd like to just take a second to say hi to our friends at No More Deaths out in Arizona. 9 of them were arrested for doing exactly what we do. They leave supplies out there to save people's lives. And because the government was trying to crack down on them out there, luckily charges were dropped and everything like that. And with Scott Warren, was retried and all the charges dropped. So we're so grateful that everybody out there is doing good. We've worked with them. They do wonderful work. They have such a large area compared to ours to cover. And there's so much depth out there. And so, yes, we're out here on the presentation with you, but there are other organizations out there as well doing great work along this whole border. And I just want to take time to acknowledge
absolutely.
that.
And, it's a constant effort. And with regards to, doing humanitarian aid along the border, what we're seeing now is, some of those 60,000 agents that are out there, they only have so much to do. And one thing that we're observing, at least in PR, one of their pushes, is that they are now trying to rebrand themselves as humanitarian aid, which if you take all of these things into consideration that we talked about is pretty sick. We're seeing it on their social media, and other bordering states and other organizations along the border have observed the same. And they're now trying to rebrand apprehensions and calling them rescues. And it really lends a moral question into what do you classify as a rescue? If your organization is putting billions and billions of dollars into funneling these people to their potential and often realized deaths, and your organization is signing billions and billions of dollars with these contracts and corporations that impact the laws of this country, that then impact their country of origin, is it a rescue if you're the aggressor? So it's been very frustrating because, you know, we're just trying to do our best to prevent as much death as possible. And what's making it incredibly difficult is all of these limitations to where we can be, limitations to what we can leave, limitations in terms of now we went from having, you know, a certain level of portion of the desert that we knew well to now we have to push through mountains, push through terrain that we're unfamiliar with because we're observing that people are being sent through unimaginable journeys, and all of this to say now we're observing the organization that has caused all of this brand themselves as the saviors, and it's pretty absurd.
And at the same time, that same agency that she's talking about that's branding themselves as these saviors and providing humanitarian aid and these rescues are the ones that are also out there making it hard for us and giving us a hard time in the harassment and putting, you know, people on government watch lists in both countries, all that just for trying to go out and help people and save lives.
If they were such a rescue organization, we would not have a protocol in place for how to leave supplies so they're not detected by Border Patrol, because previously when we first started doing this, a large percentage of everything that we left was tampered. So gallons were slashed, they would take items, that sort of thing. At one route, we found 50 gallons slashed. And so for a couple years to pass and now have this attempt at shifting the narrative in their favor, now that there is this, you know, national uprising against law enforcement, and deservedly so, it's pretty sickening, because if they didn't exist, we wouldn't have to do this, you know? So we're just constantly adapting to their increased aggression, and constantly adapting to, unfortunately, the increase in traffic that we see through the borderlands.
All while having Big Brother on our back with all the monitoring and the surveillance out there in the desert, that you may think, you know, it's so wide open out there, and how can they see everything that's going on? But there's so many sensors that we've come across and cameras that they think are hidden, but we find them. We do have routinely helicopters flying over us. We have routinely agents showing up on our hikes, agents spying on our vehicles, agents coming up to us, questioning us about trafficking. It's something that, you know, no matter what they do to try to, you know, push us up against the wall, we're still going to go out there. We're still going to do this. As long as there's lives to save out there, as long as there's, you know, people dying out there, we're going to be out there leaving supplies, and that's just, it is what it is.
Yeah, and, you know, in terms of the reach of this situation, so I know we've been talking about it just on the border, just in the desert, just in our desert, so we've made some, you know, expansion in the conversation into like Arizona and surrounding border areas, but Border Patrol's just complete lack of boundaries is something that we have always tried to emphasize with everybody that we talk to about this situation. Everybody should be alarmed about this. Their reach in government, their reach in law enforcement, their reach in technology. So they have, you know, an alarming, really scary, like talking about Big Brother level of technology that they implement at the border, but they have jurisdiction to do so in the so-called 100-mile zone. So in the 100 miles from any border
of the United States, 100 miles in air miles. So, I mean, that covers, a lot of, I think there's like 11 states that are covered completely.
2/3 of the entire American population has a limit to their Fourth Amendment rights, preventing illegal search and seizure. So your privacy is actually weakened within this 100-mile zone. And the technology that they use, that they have been developing, and it's actually really scary, including facial recognition software that they use at the checkpoints and that sort of thing. There is no reason to believe that this is going to be limited to the borderlands, or that it is limited to the borderlands. And they have kind of like free reign and then just monster budget, because it promotes, the current administration's agenda to have this just huge national police.
Yeah.
And so it's pretty scary.
Being a national law enforcement like that, a federal law enforcement, we saw what happened with the protests in the last, month and a half. And then Border Patrol gets sent out to all these places all over the country where they've never been doing work before. Exactly. But now under certain situations, or what the government deems as essential enough for them, or justified, now federal agents, this law enforcement that's, bigger than any law enforcement ever, they're the ones that are out in prairies, and they're out in, the Midwest and out in these areas that they never were and have no jurisdiction. But as such a large federal law enforcement agency, especially under this administration, they're being used like soldiers, and it's ran like the military.
Paramilitary organization that has, since its inception, behaved completely with no consequence or conscience. So that's something for the kind of thing that we promote is to, take care of one another as best as we can locally, but also think globally, think how this is impacting everybody. But we're still going to be out there as long as we have to be, until we don't have to be. And the last thing, I guess, that we want to just emphasize is that, we are leaving supplies that's simple: cans of tuna, cans of beans, cans of fruit cocktails, some gallons.
Socks, bandanas, something to protect from the sun. A lot of people get blisters out there, so a change of socks, just stuff that helps people along that we can carry along with us.
And it's just these simple items that are up against like all of that. And even so, we are not saving anybody. They are saving themselves. They are the ones that have the strength that we cannot even imagine to do so. They have the knowledge. They have the motivation to do so. And we are just leaving items. And it's unfortunately very complicated to do so, but they are absolutely saving themselves. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. And the photos that we were just seeing were all taken by you, correct, James?
Yeah, a lot of those photos, and a lot of those have found their way on social media and stuff like that, and I think that kind of helps add to telling what's real out there, and I think also that's leading to what the government doesn't like me doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So now we're going to transition to Alex. Alex Mensing is based in the Tijuana-San Diego border region. He collaborates with Pueblo Sin Fronteras, an all-volunteer transnational collective in permanent solidarity with displaced people. With PSF, Alex has accompanied several migrant caravans through Mexico and the U.S. immigration detention system, helped coordinate Know Your Rights information sessions for asylum seekers, supported migrant organizing and hunger strikes in ICE jails, and participated in campaigns against family separation, police abuse, and the criminalization of migrant rights defenders. So welcome, Alex.
Hi, everybody. First of all, thanks so much to Jackie and James for that presentation and for all the work that you do. It was really, really great to hear that, and I appreciate you putting it in the context of the corporations that benefit from that and the way that the governments push people out into the places where water is necessary, out in the desert. So thank you, and thanks to California Lawyers for the Arts for organizing this and inviting me. I'm very excited to be here, and everybody who's listening. So I hope that you do enjoy hearing about this idea that I've got to present today. So what I was thinking about in the context of this symposium about Praxis, about mobilization and migration and humanitarian work, thinking a little bit about the work that Pueblo Sin Fronteras has done and some of the challenges that we've run up against, and an idea that this is not an idea that's completely realized. This is something that a lot of folks have talked about, but I think is really necessary to talk about, to think about, and to figure out how to do. And that is organizing during migration. What I mean by that is, as you heard from James and Jackie about, is a lot of people are traveling to get to the United States either alone or in very small groups, and trying to hide and trying to enter the United States without the authorities noticing them. And that puts them in a lot of risk. It puts them in a lot of danger. And besides the danger in the desert, there's also the danger of, in the case of people from Central America, the entire country of Mexico, sometimes riding the train and all the dangers that go along with that. And then when people are coming from as far away as Cameroon or Syria or any number of other countries that people come from, it's just that much further and that much more dangerous. So one of the things that we reflect on is that there are very few efforts and very few openings to organize for collective power during the process of migration. And so I want to talk a little bit about the migrant caravans that we've helped organize and accompany in the past, and the collective power that was built during those, and think a little bit about what grassroots organizing in motion along a migratory route can look like. So just to illustrate a little bit what it is that I'm talking about, this photograph here is a photo that was taken during a migrant caravan in 2018. And the building, it's a little bit hard to tell in the photo, but basically the building with that large roof is an immigration checkpoint in Mexico, in southern Mexico. This is the Caseta de Revisión de Huehuetán. So this is Huehuetán, Chiapas, where the highway has essentially a blockade and a checkpoint. And what you see in the picture are just a few of the over 1,000 people, primarily from Central America, who were migrating in a caravan, just walking straight through this checkpoint. And this is a place, these moments that happen on all of the caravans in southern Mexico where you walk through checkpoints are some of the first big euphoric moments of exercise of collective power, because you're walking through something that symbolizes what you can't get past, in the same way that deterrence along the US-Mexico border has pushed people out into the deserts. These checkpoints in southern Mexico push people out into areas of farmland and jungle where a lot of people are assaulted, unfortunately, kidnapped, suffering all kinds of horrible violence, or just being robbed. And so to not have to go around these checkpoints and to be able to go straight through as a group and watch as immigration officers just stand by their office and let you go by is a moment of real power and real victory early on in a lot of the caravans. And so when I talk about grassroots organizing in transit, along the way, in movement, this is an example of what I'm talking about. To step back a little bit, so what does unorganized migration look like, especially in Mexico? So the image that you see on the left is a screenshot of a news article, and I apologize if that's hard for some people to look at, but I think it's important to keep in mind what the result of border imperialism and unorganized migration is. So this is a photo of a Honduran man who was stabbed while he was making his way around the same immigration checkpoint that we just saw in the previous photo. He was traveling with 2 other people in a small group. They tried to get around, walk through the countryside around the immigration checkpoint, and was assaulted. And that, unfortunately, is extremely common, especially in Chiapas, in the area that has, especially since 2014, but not exclusively since then. But in 2014, some people may recall the child migrant crisis, where there were lots of unaccompanied minors from Central America entering the United States. On the heels of that, the US government pressured the Mexican government to crack down on migration through the southern border, which has happened multiple times throughout history, and it's happening again right now. But as a result, a lot more checkpoints were installed. And the image on the right is from a Honduran paper talking about, I just think it's indicative that this image is labeled as areas of risk for migrants in Mexico. And it's basically just a list of everywhere that migrants go through in Mexico. So the idea of Mexico as a dangerous place for migrants is just so ingrained that pretty much everywhere is included. So this is what, unfortunately, the panorama looks like in many scenarios for people traveling alone or in small groups through Mexico. Now, that's not to say that they're completely alone. There's a lot of humanitarian and advocacy organizations. We just heard from Border Angels. There's also migrant shelters, some in southern United States and then throughout Mexico, soup kitchens, water drops, human rights observers. A few worth mentioning are Casa del Refugiado, which is an organization based in Mexico City that provides legal support for people applying for asylum in Mexico, housing, job training. There's Al Otro Lado that a lot of people are familiar with in the Tijuana, San Diego, LA area, who work with asylum seekers and do legal work as well. Movimiento Migrante Mesoamericano is a group that some folks might not know that accompanies the primarily mothers of disappeared migrants who disappeared in Mexico. And so they do caravans of mothers from Central America through Central America and into Mexico looking for their children who were disappeared as they tried to migrate. So there's a lot of organizations that are present along the migratory route, but like I say, these are playing a key and often overwhelming role of humanitarian aid, but not organizing directly grassroots mobilization of migrants with migrant leadership. And of course, there are organizations that do that. There's lots of them. Just in the United States, just to mention a few, there are a lot. Mi Gente, Movimiento Cosecha, and Endolon are a few organizations that organize, they do grassroots community organizing with migrants, with immigrants throughout the United States. And so it's certainly not that doesn't happen. And in the countries of origin in Central America, in Honduras, there's a really wonderful organization that works with the families of migrants and of disappeared people. Otros Dreams en Acción is a really great organization in Mexico City, primarily, that works with folks who are deported and their family members back in the United States and does organizing. So like in the previous slide, there are humanitarian organizations along the migrant route. There are grassroots organizations that work with migrants in the United States and sometimes in countries of origin, but working with people who are currently in transit, there's really not much. Pueblo Sin Fronteras, I think we strive to do that, but I think that there's a long ways to go to where you could say that is really happening. So the point that I'm hoping is clear that I'm trying to make is that we allow borders to affect when and where we engage in grassroots community organizing. And I'm not right here necessarily saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it does affect when and where we engage in community organizing, because people who are currently, who once they're in the United States may very well reach out to or be reached out to by a grassroots organization, but while they are traveling through, on their way to the United States or through the desert, there's not active organizing going on typically. And I know that we've talked a lot about the US border in the previous presentation and in general as a line, right? You know, this scar that goes across the desert, across the countryside between a lot of countries, in this case between the US and Mexico. But I think for the purposes of this conversation, it's really important to keep in mind that the border, or what some call the border regime, border imperialism, is a lot more than just that. And so just a couple examples. What is a line of Mexican National Guard members in riot gear preventing Central Americans from moving through southern Mexico towards the United States, if not an extension of the US border. You've got the actual border wall. And then when people then get across the wall, if they are detained and sent to an ICE prison, if they're in an ICE prison, have they really managed to cross the border yet, in a larger sense? And so I think that when you step back a little bit and think about what borders do to us, there's really, this can keep going. I mean, these are just a few examples, but it gets to the degree where there's really a cycle, a machinery that goes around in a cyclical manner where people can leave their home country, travel through Mexico, cross the border, be detained, work, be deported back to their home country, go back to Mexico. And there's a circuit that people's movement along this cycle is motivated and affected by border imperialism and a system of exploitation and a system of settler colonialism, imperialism that forces people to be on the move between these spaces. And one of the points I wanted to make is thinking from southern Mexico to the border wall into US ICE prisons, grassroots organizing rarely starts prior to getting into the United States. And so you see some here at Otay Mesa Detention Center with Otay Mesa Detention Resistance, other groups throughout the United States, Northwest Detention Resistance in the Portland area, striving to organize with people once they're in these ICE prisons. But prior to that, there's not much. And I did want to touch a little bit on why I think transit is not organized. Why are people not doing this? Well, one, it's really hard to do because people are moving. So you can't organize a meeting and then say, let's meet again next week or next month, like a lot of organizations do, because next week they won't be here unless you're moving. And in organizing relationships, the building of relationships is extremely important. And so how can you build a relationship with people who are constantly moving? It's not impossible, but it's a challenge. Another thing, victimization. A lot of people and organizations, intentionally or not, do look at migrants, look at asylum seekers as needing assistance, as the objects of charity, as the objects of violence, as victims in this system. And not until they're in a community where you live in the United States are there organizations who are maybe looking at them as members of civil society, agents of change, who should be encouraged to do this kind of thing. And obviously all of that, a lot of humanitarian and charity work is very important, but some of it, and I'm not talking about the Waterdrops, No More Deaths, Border Angels, there's a lot of organizations that I think keep a critical view, as we saw with the previous presenters, about why things are the way they are, how the structure works. But they're oftentimes, you can fall into this cycle of like the nonprofit industrial complex, where you're providing charity or service, like at a shelter in Mexico, and that just becomes this kind of normalized way of life that sees people as victims and doesn't seek to organize people to change the conditions in Mexico that they go through as they mobilize. And the last reason that transit is not organized is because it's really dangerous. The routes that people take are controlled basically by the government and by cartels. And the cartels are making money, and they have a reason to not allow people to organize collectively. And governments are protecting the capitalist border regime, the border imperialism. Governments have an interest in maintaining things the way they are, to have exploitable labor that can be disposed of at will and that arrives traumatized. So there's a lot of things working against organizing in transit. So it's challenging. But I think that the migrant caravans were an example. They would still be, but things have changed in Mexico, and the current government has cracked down quite brutally on new attempts to organize caravans. But the migrant caravans that occurred really quite frequently from the late 2000s and 2010 and on a small scale and locally, not going from border to border, Then in 2014, there was a migrant caravan that went all the way from the southern border near Tenosique, Tabasco, to the northern border at Reynosa into the United States. And then from 2017 to basically the end of 2018, there were 4 large migrant caravans, 3 of which were organized by members of Pueblo Sin Fronteras. And I think that they are an example of an attempt at organizing in transit. And this photo is really impactful. This was the fall 2018 exodus that many called it, that had at some points up to somewhere around 8,000, 10,000 people all traveling together. So organizing in transit, what does that look like? When Pueblo Sin Fronteras, when we started organizing caravans that we intended to go all the way from Tapachula in southern Mexico to Tijuana in northern Mexico, and then for some people to cross into the United States as asylum seekers, we did exercises in Tapachula before leaving. So you can see in the upper left, that photo, you have a gentleman who was detained previously in the United States and was deported and was now back in Tapachula trying to figure out a way to get north. And so he agreed to speak to the group of other people who were interested in joining the caravan about what it's like to be in ICE detention. On the right, upper right, you see a picture of an exercise, a nonviolent civil resistance exercise that's also a team building exercise that we did with people in a park in Tapachula in order to prepare for, in order to prepare for the caravan. And in the bottom right, you have somebody making a banner. After, in group meetings, they talked about what they wanted the banners to say. And that's part of essentially political education and messaging, deciding on the message that people want to have. And then in the bottom left is something that I added that's about providing tools and information to the people on the caravan to be able to use to make decisions, to make good decisions. So on the bottom left, what that's a picture of is a workshop with volunteer attorneys from the United States that specialize in asylum, but they are in Puebla, Mexico, which some folks may know. Puebla is pretty far south. It's further south than Mexico City, and the vast majority of Mexico is still to come if you're traveling north. The reason that we organized a workshop in Puebla is because asylum, and I'll get to this a little bit later as a bit of a side note, asylum is a tool that is can be used by oppressed people who are trying to have their rights respected if they're fleeing persecution, but it's also a tool that's used by the oppressor, in this case, the US government, to exclude people from legitimacy and to say that some people don't have a right under whatever law to be here. And so it's a complicated tool to use, but there is a reality to asylum, and rather than making the decision about whether everybody or nobody should seek asylum, we decided to organize workshops so that people would have information about how asylum works, and then individual consultations to talk about their own cases. And so that photo in the bottom left is from a workshop that was organized during a caravan. And along the caravan, once they have these tools, this preparation, this training, there are many opportunities for people to exercise collective power. And so there's some pictures here from some of the caravans. For example, the photograph on the right is one of the members of a caravan interacting and essentially negotiating with a member of the Mexican armed forces. I can't remember if that's federal police or what that is, but oftentimes the authorities in Mexico will stop the train. So that caravan was currently traveling on top of the cargo train through southern Mexico, the cargo train called the Beast that a lot of people go on. And the authorities often stop the train, pull people off, beat them up, chase them into the woods, and round up everybody they can to deport them. But in this case, everybody refused to get off, and somebody went down to negotiate and ended up essentially ended up providing, basically saying that there would be consequences to cracking down on this group that was being accompanied by human rights defenders and had access to media, and eventually they were allowed to continue. And so that's something that's become less common, but it did happen, and happened pretty frequently. In the top left, you have a meeting between some organizers, some legal assistants, the Mexican immigration authorities, and members of Caravan during the occupation that some people might remember of the port of entry. And on the bottom left, you have a press conference where members of the Caravan are, after having received training and talking about what the message is that they wanted to believe, how to talk to the press, and how to protect themselves and their cases while interacting with the press, they would do press conferences. And so those are examples of the ways in which during transit, this group of people, or these groups of people, were able to exercise collective power. And obviously arriving at the border in an organized way is much more beautiful and quite different than arriving at the border in an unorganized way. And some people might remember this moment when there was a group of people who came from Los Angeles in a caravan, and then different parts of San Diego to meet the caravan as it arrived from the US side, to meet the caravan as it arrived from southern Mexico and made it to the border. And as you can see, there are a number of caravan members, migrants, who are on top of the fence, who climbed up and sat on the fence. And it was another euphoric moment, like crossing through the immigration checkpoints in southern Mexico, where this symbol of the border, this symbol of you can't come here, you're not welcome, suddenly they were able to climb up on top of it, wave a flag, smile, and the US authorities wasted no time in calling this a taunting of the United States and disrespect to the United States by going up on this wall. And there were even some immigrant rights organizations in the United States who believed that that was a bad idea because of image, because of the way it looked. And I just couldn't disagree more. I think that this was a really beautiful moment where people had lost the fear of that symbol, and they made it their own, and they made it a moment of triumph. And I think that that was really beautiful. And I think that there's a lot of reasons why some people unfortunately don't quite see it that way. And then beyond the border, I think this is really important. One of the reasons that I think that organizing in transit is so important is because then when people enter this really oppressive, really exploitative system in the United States, or even in border cities like Tijuana, they have organizing under their belt, and they have experienced what it's like to build collective power. So the Adelanto 9 were a group of Central American migrants who were detained at Adelanto ICE prison, 2 of whom were members of the Migrant Caravan in 2017. And then they organized together and held a hunger strike. And they've won a lawsuit because they were attacked while peacefully protesting by guards inside the ICE prison. On the photo on the right is of a campaign against police abuse against migrants in Tijuana that was led by members of the caravan who decided to stay in Tijuana. Some of those people are still in Tijuana. And so that the organizing effort that went into transit continued. And on the left, you have a photo from Otay Mesa Detention Center. That's Edgar on the left. He was also a member of a caravan. He was detained at Otay Mesa, organized protests while he was there. Once he won his asylum claim and was released, he's moved to Los Angeles, and he continues organizing. On the right, you have somebody from a former member of a caravan protesting outside the White House when a member of Pueblo Sin Fronteras was arrested and put in jail by the Mexican government for human trafficking, accused of human trafficking on false charges that we were able to get thrown out. And the last thing that I think that caravan members have contributed to is actually participating in coordinating and assisting and accompanying future caravans. And so after organizing several caravans over the period of 2 years, we started to see in some cases, people returning of their own volition from northern Mexico to southern Mexico to accompany caravans and to share the knowledge that they had learned. And in some cases, people who had been deported but had been on a caravan participating in caravans. And in some cases, former caravan members, like what happened in fall 2018, actually participating in organizing caravans to leave Central America with people who are trying to escape. And this point that I wanted to come to about legal borders. So I think that the law also establishes borders, and asylum, as I mentioned before, is a tool of the oppressed and of the oppressor. I think on the one hand, people can use it obviously in order to get asylum, but governments use it, like I mentioned before, to exclude people. And so this tool, as a kind of a picker and chooser, a good immigrant, bad immigrant, is a challenging element of organizing. So I don't want to make it seem like the caravans are the only example of people trying to organize across borders. There's also other really great groups like Espacio Migrante here in Tijuana and San Diego, Movimiento Migrante Mesoamericano, and Otros Dreams in Acción that I mentioned previously. So I think that there are other examples of this, but this is a bit of an unfinished idea. I think that I don't know the extent to which any of this is happening in Northern Africa or the Middle East or Asia, where there are also massive displacements of people, forced displacement of people. But I think that this is a tactic that we need to continue to develop and something that needs to continue to be worked on. However, in the spirit of complicating, as the description of this symposium says, of complicating this whole idea, sometimes we look back at our experience in the caravans and we think about, is it really a good idea to facilitate the mass fleeing of people who are just going to come into the United States, go into an ICE prison, be there, get depressed. At least one member of a caravan who I know did die in the desert, died in the Arizona desert where no more dust goes out and leaves water, and he just didn't find any. And there are people who go and then they get into these, into jobs where they're exploited. And so sometimes we wonder whether or not this is the right thing to do, but a few factors to end now that I think are really important to take into consideration of why this is a good idea to do. One, that the violence and oppression exercised on people while they're in transit by the system of border imperialism, by the border control regime, contributes to the exploitability of migrants. So what I mean by that is if people are traumatized on their way to the United States, they're oftentimes more exploitable. Sometimes people talk about the word resilience and people going through things and that making them stronger. And I think that sometimes that's true, but systematic violence against people is not to make them stronger. It's to make them more controllable and exploitable by capital. Then I think that there are many examples in history of diasporas and people in exile fighting for justice back in their home countries, and organizing in transit could facilitate the fomentation of that. And then I think it's also, like a lot of organizing efforts, about planting seeds of resistance during a point in time in somebody's life that's really critical, which is when they're in transit, when they're fleeing, they've left for whatever reason the place that they live and they're going somewhere else. Being able to empower that groups of people on that journey to build collective power during that time, I think is really important. So again, this is an idea that I love to keep discussing tonight and into the future, and I hope that other folks found it interesting.
Yeah, thank you to each of our presenters tonight. First, I wanted to just appreciate the way that you all presented the work you do with such humility and passion. And before we do continue the conversation, I did just want to take a moment to acknowledge, I know each of you mentioned sort of the folks that have been lost along the way in the process of migration. And I know that that is something very difficult to sit with and to know. For those of us that do transit on both sides of the border, we know that's a reality. So I just wanted to take a moment to honor those folks. As you all mentioned, we don't have all of their names, some of them even, and sort of, just appreciating you all bringing it back full circle to the reality of what it means to cross borders, to travel, to make that attempt. So we did want to open up for Q&A to each of our presenters. I do have a question to begin the conversation, maybe specifically under the current administration where we've seen different legislation pass. I know here, as a person who lives on this side of the border and crosses, we're able to witness the physical changes. I know James and Jackie spoke to the changes in their routes and even how your work has become even more difficult. But I did want to kind of acknowledge something that Alex shared before we began the presentation of your work becoming more difficult under this current administration in the US, but also on the other side of the border, where we know that migrants that are arriving to Tijuana are coming from other countries like Central America, Haiti, Cameroon, etc. Both of you, or whoever would like to begin first to speak about maybe the ways your work has had to adapt or change on either side of the border due to the administration.
For us, at least, I mean, we both started just a few months before Trump took office. So it's kind of hard on our end to give a fair type of assessment of before or after, because most of what we've worked out there has been during the Trump administration. We have noticed, I mean, things have slowly been getting more and more, I don't know what the right way to say it would be, but I mean, there is more surveillance on us and there is more watch and more pressure put on us. I think it comes in waves. Right now it's, sometime, some weeks we'll go out there and we'll get, constantly being followed. And then some weeks we just won't have any interaction at all. So it's kind of hard you can't predict what the agencies out there are going to be doing. And it's, I don't know if it's random or not.
Right.
Yeah.
I think also the types of items that we find, because it's interesting because we at times do encounter people in the process, while they're in their journey, but we typically don't interact with the people who we are leaving the supplies for. And it's kind of like this unspoken conversation that we have with them, like through the items that we find. And we've been finding a lot more evidence of children crossing, women crossing before, early on in the Trump administration, before MPP, before all of these other policies that have changed things. Like, we had a different demographic that we observed.
And just to add from my perspective, so the first time I was working on issues of immigration, for example, I worked with the legal aid group, the Dilley Pro Bono Project in Dilley, Texas, which is where there's a family detention center. It's a jail for moms and kids, immigrant moms and kids in the middle of South Texas. And that was under the Obama administration in 2015 and 2016 when I was there. And women and children were getting deported. They were getting picked up by Border Patrol. There were some phenomenally horrible raids by ICE in Atlanta, midnight raids at like 3, 4 in the morning that targeted specifically families, women with children, and something like over 100 women or children were picked up in a midnight ICE raid from their homes in Atlanta and sent to the Dilley ICE prison. And so I think that, like, James mentioned before, this isn't a blue issue, it's not a red issue, it's a green issue. And I think it's also beyond the money that corporations are making from the prison industrial complex and the border industrial complex. Beyond that, there's the entire system of border imperialism that basically displaces people as a form of exploitable labor. And so the entire system is designed to do that. But I do think that Trump has really taken a toll. And I guess I'll take a moment to call on anybody who's watching this. If you haven't yet, I think Human Rights First is doing this. There's a number of immigrant rights organizations that are calling right now on people to comment on the proposed changes to asylum that are essentially doing away with asylum. Currently, the Trump administration is trying to do away with many elements of asylum. But the change that Diana alluded to earlier in Mexico, under the previous administration, which was not a good government in Mexico. Nonetheless, during the caravans, we were able to exercise collective power to make it to the northern border. The new president, AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who very recently went to go visit Trump, he has taken upon himself, he's charged the National Guard with cracking down on migration. He's given the National Guard the faculty to support immigration agents, and they have truly militarized the efforts to stop any organization from happening. I mean, in Tapachula, in the city in southern Mexico where we would organize, the National Guard and immigration agents and local police members are literally they are patrolling the parks and public spaces, and any group of migrants of more than 4 or 5 people is broken up in order to prevent people from organizing. So there has been a massive change in the last year, really, since the new Mexican government came into place. And obviously that is under pressure from Trump, because the Trump administration threatens to impose tariffs on Mexico and essentially try to cripple their economy if they didn't agree to crack down on immigrants. So unfortunately, we see again that migrants are being used as, in Spanish they say the moneda de cambio. They're basically being sold off for political gain by the government.
Thank you so much. And I think both of your responses and sort of the work that you shared today really speaks to the convergence of these systems of policing and these legal apparatuses, right, that empower sort of this heightened militarization, heightened policing, and also thinking about the work that I know your organizations do is predominantly volunteer work or grant funded or things like that. So I know that what you all were saying, it's like, we just want to take supplies, or we just want to help people organize and maybe think through a plan against all these systems. So thank you for speaking about that and reminding us it also transcends beyond just what you're facing in the US. I did want to share a few questions that people wrote into the chat, so I'll just read them as they were written, and whoever would like to take a go, please feel free. So a question to all the panelists. What are the ways that you practice solidarity with the indigenous peoples on whose land this aid, organizing, and migration is happening? As someone in San Diego, I'm thinking in particular of the Kumeyaay Nation and Kumeyaay resistance to the border wall.
So yeah, we're absolutely in solidarity with the Kumeyaay people. We have been in communication with the Kumeyaay Defense Against the Wall, and we have collected donations, taken donations to where the land defenders are posted in order to survey what is occurring at the wall.
We've also raised thousands of dollars for them, for their camp, and for any type of legal defense, anything that they need on our personal and as well as the organization's platform. We've been to the demonstrations. We've had members at every single demonstration that's been, and that's just in relationship to the wall and everything that's going on in that location where the construction is. But every time we're out there, I mean, we both have native roots, so we honor that, and we honor our family members by every time we're out there in the desert, we're always collecting trash. We're always trying to make it better, whether it's items that have been left behind by people crossing through the desert, whether it's people out there, doing their recreational shooting or garbage on the side of the road, or border patrol, or whoever is leaving trash out there. We always make sure that we're, taking out and trying to make better the desert land that we're in.
Yeah, but we encourage everybody to, follow them, look them up, Kumeyaay Defense Against the Wall. They are, resisting against the proposed dynamite blowing up of their sacred lands, of their, the remains of their ancestors. And so it's very serious to us, and we're in solidarity with them, definitely.
Yeah, after we're done in the desert on Saturday, we're going to meet with them again, deliver anything further that they need, any supplies, any help. We're going to go over some safety items with them, because we don't expect that this is going to be something that goes away quick. And with it being really hot out there, we want to make sure that everybody's taking care of themselves and practicing safety, knowing their rights with Border Patrol and all that stuff.
To add a little bit more, with Pueblo Sin Fronteras, where we've had more interaction and experience working with indigenous communities, is actually in southern Mexico during the caravans. There are a lot of folks from who are adherents to the Sixth Declaration of the Wakandan Desert with the EZLN have participated in organizing some of the logistical support for the caravans. And from Guerrero, the indigenous community of Ayotzinapa has provided some logistical and transportation support on some of the caravans. And there's always been discussions about further collaboration that are not really for discussion here, but that's something really important because migratory routes through and across indigenous land has always been the interaction between indigenous authorities and indigenous people has always been quite in contrast to the interaction between settler colonial authorities. And in Oaxaca particularly, there have been some really incredible showings of support from largely indigenous communities and unions for previous caravans a little bit further in the past, to the point of essentially direct confrontation with local law enforcement. So that's where we have more experience. I'm relatively new to the Tijuana, San Diego area, but one of the members of Pueblo Sin Fronteras, who's been here more, participates in a lot of the meetings with the Kumeyaay and is hopefully going to organize a chance for some of those who are here, those of us who are here now with PSF to be able to go meet them.
What are some of the ways in which you have been able to deal with some of the trauma that comes with working either directly or indirectly with migrants?
That's a really good question. And I think that I'm maybe not the best person to answer that question. Especially through work with folks who are asylum seekers detained to ICE prisons, definitely went through some periods where I was listening to a lot and didn't always react in a healthy way. And it can be really difficult. It can be really, really traumatizing. And I think that one of the ways for me to deal with that, one, has been taking more time for myself. I don't think I know enough about self-care to be able to use the term self-care, but for me sometimes it's just taking time, taking a break every once in a while. And also for me it ends up being a lot of converting that into energy towards thinking about and working on ways to address structural issues, not so much of just listening to stories. And individual accompaniment is really important, but collective action geared towards at least thinking about on the horizon what it is that you're working towards, a world where people are not forcibly displaced from their communities. Because at the end of the day, my goal is not to help people flee the place that they had to flee. It's more to work towards, with all the other people who are in this, work towards and struggle towards a world in which people don't have to flee in the first place, where the US government is not exercising its capital imperialist power in a way that forces people to have to leave. That's certainly a long way off if it's ever going to happen, but focusing on that and keeping that horizon in mind and thinking about the ways in which the work that I and the people around me are doing contribute towards that is one of the ways that maybe it's a bit of an indirect way of coping with the trauma of what the stories that a lot of people have to tell. But it's that at least keeps me focused on that.
Can also relate to not always having coped in a healthy manner. It varies. There are some experiences that can be considered traumatic that I think we didn't necessarily process as having been traumatic in the moment. It's just, the kind of like the work goes on and we've kind of put our head down and kept going until, I'm going to speak for myself and not James, until it hit me in sort of like inopportune moments and I had to pause and be like, okay, what is this? Because I was experiencing like actual physical pains, and I started thinking more and reading more up on like vicarious trauma and like the trauma that you can, I don't want to say absorb, but like process internally, like from having observed or witnessed or whatever, like the trauma of others. And it's giving some importance to that, because I think sometimes like I didn't view that as the priority, and having to reframe that as like, okay, if we don't take care of ourselves, what's going to become of this work that we care about so much? And also focusing, I think, our efforts. We had a conversation when we were going to Tijuana before, and I still go to Mexicali to the shelters and everything, but for a minute there we were our efforts were a little bit more dispersed, And we had a conversation that we just had to focus, and we chose to focus on the desert. And I think, at least for me, that definitely brought a little bit more breathing room. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't really do too well. I mean, I don't do too well with like emotions and stuff like that. I'm not, every now and again, I'll have a random, like, cry or something like that. But it's in the moment, I don't feel too much in the moment because I'm focused on the work. And I know that the stuff I see has to lead to more work because this is coming, with so many more people behind it. And I'm sure it's not healthy that I don't process this stuff, but the way that I do is I just organize, I strategize, and I just get back out there. And my body hurts sometimes because of it, but
I try to get him to process, but
you do as much as you can. At the end of the day, if you make it to the next one, you repeat. That's my motto.
I think it's been really good. I mean, it's so important to have people that you're in community with that like also see and understand like what you do, that you can talk things out on. It doesn't have to be this big process, session, but you can relate to one another, because like you get into these extreme situations sometimes, and like it can kind of alienate you from your previous community of like family and friends, because they don't see this stuff and they don't know what this is like. So having people that do know what it's like, that can relate to you, that our chosen family, that's been huge. And also maintaining connections with the people that don't. So having those like kind of normal conversations and interactions where you're just having fun.
Yeah, it's one of those type of fields that we're in, that I think that unless you're talking with people who are also involved, it's not like people, I think, to an extent can understand.
Yeah.
And I mean, that goes with relationships too. And, we've come and gone on relationships because, partners haven't understood, things that we've gone through and things that we do and things that we see and things we experience. And you surround yourself with like-minded people, and you talk about it with each other, and you process it kind of like in that way. But it's not something that you have to do a big to-do about. You just, you talk about it, and then you work together on, going forward.
As an artist, what would you say you would like to see from people like me and the artist community to help build collective power using art?
I think that one of the things that I've seen be really, really powerful for artists to do, portraying what's going on is always helpful, in the way that raising awareness is always helpful. And I think that art and images have the power to make people think about things in a way that maybe just talking about it definitely does not. But if you are an artist who has the ability to work with people who are in Tijuana, or who are currently in the process of migrating, or in any point along this, what I see as a cycle of travel and of displacement that border imperialism causes people to have to do, if you have a way to work with people so that people can learn about how to do the art that you do, maybe not in the same way that you do it, that's really powerful. We've got really good, he may be listening to this, Jeff, but uses his photography not only to portray a side of the migrant experience that a lot of people don't focus on, but also to help share those skills with people. And I think that's really powerful. So I think that sometimes sharing your talent with people so that they can contribute artistically to the world in a way that you can help them do better, I think that is really powerful. And I think that there's not enough of that. So that's one of many things that I think that could be done.
Unfortunately, right now, because of COVID, we're not taking any new volunteers for the Waterdrop program for the meantime, just because we want to keep that kind of like small little bubble of folks that we are exposing one another to. And the groups are small as well, but definitely following what we do, sharing. What else do you think?
Even, donations to our website. Everything that helps out, follows, likes, shares on social media. if you've been out, with us at events, tell people, what you see and, what it's been and what you've experienced, and just word of mouth, the old fashioned way.
Yeah, and speaking to the art aspect, as a completely non-artistic person, but somebody that's very impressed by others' artistic talents and moved by it. I think, we're in that time, especially like with, the pandemic and everything, and we're so distanced, that art is so critical right now to convey messages, to grab attention, that sort of thing. So creating and sharing, taking whatever your inspiration is by any of the work that you're either involved in or observing and supporting, and putting that out there, it makes a difference,
And I will second Alex in saying that our friend Jeff Valenzuela, wonderful photography from the ground, and makes you feel like you're there. Really great.
Well, I just wanted to reiterate just our appreciation on behalf of California Lawyers for the Arts. And I know Sara and I, as people who are transborder individuals, we definitely are familiar with your work and familiar with the level of organizing and hours and sort of even emotional sort of resilience that goes into it as organizers. But also, I think one point that you all mentioned, acknowledging the power that migrants, refugees, and folks that are just seeking, a different life. Unfortunately, oftentimes that's forced. So I just wanted to say thank you for honoring that and honoring them. So before we end, we're going to share some words from our executive director.
Thank you for joining our second annual symposium, Intersections, Art and Law at the Border. My name is Alma Robinson, and I'm the executive director of California Lawyers for the Arts. The COVID-19 pandemic provided us with an opportunity to reframe this symposium as a series of virtual programs. These will all be posted on our YouTube channel, along with other useful art law webinars. Many thanks to the San Diego Commission for Arts and Culture, the California Arts Council, the law firm of Perkins Coie, and other members of California Lawyers for the Arts for making this program possible. Thanks also to our San Diego Steering Committee, to the speakers for their excellent presentations, and our staff in Southern California for the many hours they dedicated to producing this series. If you have specific legal questions, please contact our lawyer referral service for assistance. We also offer a range of alternative dispute resolution services and an ongoing schedule of educational programs on various legal and business topics. I hope that you've enjoyed tonight's program and encourage you to browse our website for future programs and other information, including a list of COVID-related relief resources. Please consider joining CLA in order to help support our work as we advocate for the arts as an essential sector of our society. Thank you for your participation.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Please feel free to also follow us on social media. Here is our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our panelists.